Let's get a fresh perspective now on Yahya Sinwar's death with Professor Simon Mabon, who joins us from Lancaster University, where he's a lecturer in international relations and Middle East studies. Thanks so much, Professor Mabon. These images, these last images that we saw of Yahya Sinwar throwing a stick at an Israeli drone, let's just talk about the symbolism of that. How do you think Palestinians will be reacting to those images, and possibly Israelis on the other side?
Yeah, it's a hugely symbolic act of defiance from Yahya Sinwar, clearly mindful of his impending demise and wanting to depict some type of defiance in his final moments. But I think that there's a very deliberate decision being made here to release this image, to show that there is a particular outcome of standing up to Israel, that the Israeli Defense Forces have tried to do this to diminish any of that legitimacy that he had sought, to try and erode any of those quote unquote resistance credentials. This is not, in the Israeli eyes at least, a glorious demise. This is a fragile capitulation. And I think what we're seeing with the release of this video is a further demonstration that this is not just a physical conflict playing out across Gaza and beyond, but rather it's also a battle over quote-unquote legitimacy, but also the broader narrative and how to frame all of this.
And yet, we have a senior Hamas official now saying that the group cannot be eliminated despite the killing of its leaders. They haven't actually confirmed Yahya Sinwar's death. They say it's a liberation movement. Does that kind of statement put anxiety into the Israeli military? Does it complicate matters further?
I don't think it complicates matters further. I think it's the sort of thing that one would have expected to hear from senior Hamas figures. As I said previously, this is about a discursive framing of events. Hamas has undeniably been weakened by the killing of Yahya Sinwar. And also it's trying to demonstrate that, well, even though we have lost our leader, we will not be defeated. We are still going to fight. We are a quote-unquote resistance organization, a liberation organization, and that you cannot defeat us by killing one figurehead. And I think this is really the crux of the matter. It's about how do you continue to demonstrate the legitimacy of your actions at a time when the conflict is dramatically going against you in the case of Hamas. So it is a really, really important thing to frame it in a particular way. And we're seeing both the Israelis and Hamas trying to frame things that support their own position within the broader context.
Nonetheless, Sinwar was seen as a key obstacle as far as Benjamin Netanyahu's administration was concerned in retrieving the remaining 97 hostages. Now that he's gone, what excuse does Benjamin Netanyahu have to not get the hostages back?
Well, that's a very good question. The thought was that initially, before Yahya Sinwar took over the leadership role, there would have been an opportunity. Ismail Haniyeh was not seen to be the hardliner that Yahya Sinwar was. And so there's maybe an argument to say, well, if there was a real desire to get the hostages back and to actually make a diplomatic agreement to end the conflict and return the hostages, then that would have been possible under Ismail Haniyeh. Now, that became more difficult under Yahya Sinwar, of course. He's a more hardline figure. He had an existential hatred of Israel by virtue of his own past experiences and his ideological outlook. Everything that has happened over these past few months makes the sort of diplomatic engagement and a diplomatic agreement more and more difficult because it breeds more and more resentment. The conflict becomes more and more intractable. Now, of course, a diplomatic solution is the only way out of this. And I would hope that if there is a more moderate figure from the Hamas side, it would put increased pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu and indeed others to make this type of agreement possible.
And yet he will certainly be feeling the effects of the hard or far right elements of the Israeli government, which have propelled him into power effectively. At the same time, you've got the Western leaders saying that possibly this is also an inflection and it might point towards an end of the war in sight. Which side of the camp are you?
Well, the other thing is that there's growing pressure from within Israel, from the families of the hostages, who are saying you need to bring our family members home. So it is a very, very precarious moment for Benjamin Netanyahu and his political future, in the sense that he's having to navigate the pressure from the right, from the religious right, from the ideological right, from the families of the hostages, from, I would say, from the Western powers, but they have been largely absent in terms of putting significant pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu. But the international community is certainly starting to put pressure on. So it is a precarious moment for him, for his own political career. But the bigger issue, of course, is the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are in absolutely devastating humanitarian conditions, millions on the brink of dire humanitarian crises in Gaza, in South Lebanon and beyond. And getting a resolution is the most important thing here.
Well, you would think, but obviously there are those elements which say this has strengthened Netanyahu's position, and
Exactly.
He's taken out a key leader here. So nonetheless, the optics are still good for him.
They are, yeah, the optics are good. Why would you compromise when you have such a strong hand? He's taken out Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. He's taken out Ismail Haniyeh, the former leader of Hamas. He's now taken out Yahya Sinwar, the current leader of Hamas and the architect of October 7. So he's on a bit of a roll in this regard. But the devastation, the catastrophic loss of life across Gaza, the destruction of Gaza, the destruction of South Lebanon is harrowing. And there is growing international pressure from around the world that is going to start to really put pressure on him, on his political future. The ICC is going to have to make a judgment call as to the arrest warrants. That crescendo of noise is going to start ratcheting up more and more. And we know that he said that this is now the beginning of the end. But what the end actually looks like, I guess, is the next $1 million question. Unfortunately, there's so many of them right now.
And we've seen the situation change day by day, but still no resolution, still no ceasefire, and still no hostage release. In terms of that, you did touch on it, and we saw it in the report just before. Who does Israel now negotiate with in terms of Hamas to get those hostages back?
Well, they weren't ever really negotiating with Yahya Sinwar. There were negotiations that took place through mediators, either in Egypt or in Qatar, and those lines of communication will remain open. But the question is, who is the one taking the decisions about, on the Hamas side, I should say, about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable? Is it someone like Khalid Meshal in Doha, who has the years of experience of leading Hamas, but doesn't have the legitimacy or the credibility amongst the people of Gaza, given that he's been living in the comfort of Doha for the past however many years? Or is it someone who's actually battle-hardened, who's been fighting the Israelis, who has that first-hand experience of the conflict, but doesn't necessarily have the political acumen or the wider networks that would be needed to engage in a broader diplomatic process? And I think that's the question that Hamas has got to deal with. How do they balance those two different sides? And the answer to that, I think, will impact on the approach moving forward. But ultimately, I think that the big thing that will be deciding what comes next is the approach taken by Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet, because they are the ones that are ultimately taking the decisions about what to do in Gaza, what to do in South Lebanon, ignoring the calls of Israelis, ignoring the calls of Palestinians, ignoring the calls of the UN, ignoring the calls of the ICC, ignoring the calls of the international community.
And all coming as Israel steps up its offensive in the Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza. Thank you, as always, Professor Simon Mabon from Lancaster University, for that thorough outlook and unpacking of the situation.